In the freezing dark of a 13th-century cell, two shadows merge in a silence that defies God. Behind heavy oak doors, the scent of incense masks a forbidden heat that the Church called impossible, yet feared enough to destroy. This was no holy prayer, it was a secret sisterhood of passion, thriving where no man was allowed to watch. In the midnight silence of a monastic corridor, where the stones are saturated with the scent of incense and dampness, a sound emerges that should not exist within the walls of the Brides of Christ. It is neither a prayer nor a sigh of repentance, but a rhythmic whisper that turns into a suppressed sob, hidden behind a heavy oak door of a narrow cell. In the 13th century, beneath the grey vaults of these abbeys, dramas unfolded that chroniclers chose to ignore, yet the very stones seemed to absorb the vibration of forbidden lives. Here, in a space designed for asceticism and isolation, women found in each other what the law and religion only promised them in the world to come. When two shadows merged into one on the cold stone floor, the crucifix hanging on the wall became the sole witness to a union that the Church officially could not even classify. For a long time, in the eyes of theologians, a sin without the participation of a man was considered an impossible nonsense, a biological absurdity that did not fit into the catalogues of depravity. This conceptual blindness allowed a secret world to flourish, where the touch of a hand or the warmth of a shared bed became a sanctuary against the harshness of a world that demanded total submission. The flickering candle cast long, trembling shapes against the masonry, masking a love that had no name. To understand this hidden landscape, one must look at the 13th century as an era where the monastery was the only refuge for women who refused to be pawns in the game of dynastic marriages. Thousands of daughters from noble families, sent away with dowries of land and gold, found themselves locked in a world entirely absent of men, where their only family consisted of other rejected or saved sisters. These closed communities formed a unique hierarchy of emotions, where educated women who read Latin and studied polyphonic music created their own rules of intimacy. Away from the prying eyes of fathers, they built a society where the boundaries of affection began to blur. Within these stone walls, the pursuit of knowledge often walked hand in hand with the cultivation of deep, emotional bonds that transcended mere friendship. A sister might spend her days illuminating manuscripts with golden ink, her mind wandering toward the woman who sat across from her in the scriptorium, sharing a silent language of glances. The intellectual freedom found in the convent was a double-edged sword, it allowed for a life of the mind but also nurtured a sensitivity that sought physical expression. As they studied the lives of saints, these women discovered that the human heart did not stop yearning for touch simply because it had been pledged to the divine. The very layout of the medieval abbey facilitated these clandestine connections, despite the rules intended to enforce solitude. Common dormitories where beds were placed side by side, or the long hours of nocturnal prayer, provided countless opportunities for stolen moments and whispered confidences. In the darkness of the chapel during the third hour of the morning, the brush of a sleeve or the interlocking of fingers under the cover of heavy robes felt like a rebellion against the cold. The architecture was designed to direct the soul upward toward heaven, yet it simultaneously created a labyrinth of shadows where the body could seek comfort in the arms of an equal. Church law during the early 13th century was strangely silent on the matter of intimacy between women, focusing its wrath almost exclusively on male transgression and the spilling of seed. This theological gap provided a strange sort of protection for the sisters, as their actions were often dismissed as mere feminine folly or harmless displays of excessive sisterly affection. Because the patriarchal mind could not conceive of a sexual act that did not involve a phallus, the profound physical relationships developing in the convents remained beneath the radar of the high clergy. This ignorance was a gift of time, allowing generations of women to define their own companionships. As the century progressed, many sisters began to use the language of religious mysticism to shield their earthly passions from scrutiny. They spoke of the burning fire of divine love and the spiritual marriage to the bridegroom, but the intensity of their descriptions often mirrored the physical ecstasy they found in one another. When an abbess described her soul melting into the presence of another, her words could be interpreted as a pious metaphor, even if the reality was far more tangible and human. This clever masking of desire allowed them to navigate the dangerous waters of medieval dogma, turning the tools of their confinement into a language of liberation and shared identity. The figure of the abbess was central to this secret culture, acting as both a spiritual mother and a protector of the community's hidden life. Many of these high-born women possessed immense political power and wealth, ruling over their lands with the same authority as any secular lord. Within their private quarters, an abbess might choose a favorite among the younger novices, creating a bond that combined mentorship with a deep, personal devotion that everyone in the abbey understood but no one dared to name. These relationships were the structural pillars of the convent, ensuring loyalty and creating a network of support that could withstand the occasional intrusions of outside men. Despite the thick walls and the vow of silence, whispers of what truly happened behind the gates began to leak into the surrounding villages and the courts of the powerful. Rumors of sisters who were too close, of nights spent in shared cells, and of tears shed at the parting of companions became part of the folklore of the era. These stories were often told with a mix of mockery and genuine confusion, as the secular world struggled to understand a community that functioned perfectly well without the governance of men. Yet, for the women inside, these whispers were a constant reminder of the fragile nature of their sanctuary, a warning that the world was beginning to take notice. The convent was not just a house of God but a repository for the inconvenient women of the aristocracy, those who were too intelligent or simply redundant in the eyes of their fathers. This concentration of strong-willed and often highly educated individuals created a pressure cooker of untapped potential and suppressed emotion. In the absence of traditional family structures, the bond of sisterhood evolved into a complex web of romantic and platonic ties that provided the only emotional sustenance available. The 13th century abbey thus became an unintentional experiment in female autonomy, where the shared experience of exile forged alliances that were about human connection. As the middle of the 13th century approached, the relative indifference of the Church began to transform into a more structured suspicion. New orders of friars and stricter inquisitorial methods started to peel back the layers of monastic life, looking for signs of moral decay that had previously been overlooked. The casual acceptance of spiritual friendships was replaced by a rigid obsession with purity and the eradication of any behavior that could be seen as a deviation from the natural order. The women of the convents, once left to their own devices in the shadows of the cloisters, now found themselves under a new kind of scrutiny where every gesture was reinterpreted. The chapter of hidden peace was drawing to a close, and the air within the stone corridors grew heavy with the anticipation of change. The rhythmic whispers that once offered comfort now carried the weight of fear, and the heavy oak doors felt less like a shield and more like a trap. The 13th century, which had allowed these lesbian orders to exist in a state of quiet normalcy, was preparing to unleash a wave of reform that would seek to extinguish the very flame of intimacy that had kept these women alive. As the sun set over the jagged rooftops of the abbey, the shadows grew longer, stretching toward a future where their love would soon be branded a crime. In the 13th century, the map of a young woman's life was drawn not by her own desires but by the ink of her father's ledgers. For the daughters of the high nobility, the world was a marketplace where their bodies served as currency to seal alliances and expand territories. To be born into a family of the upper class meant being groomed for a marriage that was often a cold, transactional arrangement with a man twice or thrice her age. In this landscape of rigid social obligations, the convent appeared as a strange paradox, standing as both a prison of stone and an unexpected sanctuary from the relentless demands of the patriarchal hearth. The dowry required to enter a prestigious abbey was often as significant as the one needed for a secular wedding, consisting of vast tracts of fertile land, chests of shimmering gold, and intricate tapestries. When a girl of 12 or 14 years was led to the heavy gates of the monastery, her family viewed it as a divine investment, a way to ensure their lineage was blessed while simultaneously reducing the number of heirs. Within these walls, the daughter of a count or a duke was stripped of her silk gowns and dressed in the coarse wool of the order, beginning a transformation that would sever her from the world of men and its many violent claims. This entrance into the religious life was portrayed as a death to the world, yet for many, it was the beginning of a life where the absence of men created a unique vacuum of power and emotion. In the secular world, a woman was always under the shadow of a father, a husband, or a brother, but once the heavy iron bolt of the cloister was drawn, that shadow vanished. The monastery became a fortress where the masculine gaze could not easily penetrate, and where the hierarchy was composed entirely of women. This isolation from the external world of knights and kings allowed for the development of a subterranean culture that followed its own secret heart. Inside the abbey, the daughters of the elite found themselves surrounded by peers who shared their education, their refinement, and their hidden frustrations. These were women who had been taught to read Latin, to understand the complexities of music, and to manage vast estates, making them some of the most intellectual figures of their time. Without the constant cycle of pregnancy and the domestic duties of a noble household, their mental and emotional energy had to find new outlets. The shared experience of being discarded by the secular marriage market forged a bond of solidarity that often evolved into something far deeper than mere companionship or common prayer. The physical architecture of the medieval convent was designed for communal living, but this very design became the fertile soil for prohibited intimacy. The rule of Saint Benedict and other monastic codes emphasized that a nun should never be truly alone, yet they did not anticipate the consequences of constant female proximity. From the early morning hours of matins to the final prayers of Compline, the sisters moved as a single body, their shoulders brushing in the choir and their hands meeting over the laundry. Every moment of the day was a shared experience, creating a physical familiarity that slowly eroded the barriers of the individual self. One of the most significant spaces for this developing intimacy was the scriptorium, where the silence of the room was filled with the rhythmic scratching of quills on parchment. Here, the most talented sisters worked together to copy sacred texts, their heads bowed over the same desk as they mixed pigments and applied gold leaf. In this atmosphere of intense focus and quiet cooperation, a glance or a subtle movement of the hand could convey a wealth of meaning that no confessor could ever detect. The intellectual labor of the monastery was not just a service to God, but a way for two women to build a shared world of thought that excluded the rest of the community. The common dormitory was perhaps the most provocative setting for the formation of these secret orders within the order. Long rows of narrow beds were placed in a single large hall, separated only by thin partitions or sometimes nothing at all. While the rules demanded that a lamp remain lit throughout the night to discourage any unseemly behavior, the flickering shadows and the heavy darkness of the corners provided a veil for those who sought the warmth of another. In the freezing winters of the 13th century, the excuse of seeking heat became a doorway to a physical closeness that the Church had no words to describe or regulate. The absence of male supervision within the living quarters of the nuns was a critical factor that allowed these relationships to flourish undetected. While a priest or a bishop might visit the abbey to hear confessions or perform mass, they were strictly forbidden from entering the private areas where the sisters slept, bathed, and relaxed. This meant that for 23 hours of the day, the women were the masters of their own social environment. In this vacuum of masculine authority, the traditional rules of conduct were often subtly rewritten to accommodate the emotional needs of the women who lived there, creating a private reality. The intellectual life of the convent was centered around the study of Latin, a language that was effectively a secret code known only to the educated elite. By using the elevated prose of the Church Fathers and the erotic imagery of the Song of Solomon, the sisters could express their devotion to each other under the guise of religious fervor. A letter written from one sister to another might speak of the soul's longing for its mate, using terms that were perfectly orthodox on the surface but vibrated with a hidden, earthly passion. This sophisticated linguistic masking allowed their love to hide in plain sight, protected by the very texts meant to sanctify them. Music also played a vital role in the emotional architecture of the 13th century monastery, acting as a bridge between the spiritual and the sensual. The practice of polyphonic singing, where different voices intertwined to create a complex harmony, required a deep level of synchronization and mutual understanding. When two sisters sang together, their voices fused in a way that felt like a physical embrace, creating a sensory experience that transcended the written word. In the echoes of the stone chapel, the music became a medium through which they could express the intensity of their connection without ever having to break the vow of silence. The internal hierarchy of the convent often reflected the social standing of the sisters in the outside world, but it was also influenced by the personal favors of the abbess. A powerful abbess could act as a matriarchal figure who protected her favorites, granting them private cells or special duties that allowed them more time together. These alliances were not just about power, they were about creating a small, safe circle of intimacy within the larger group. For a young novice, the protection and affection of an older, more established sister was a lifeline in the often harsh and cold environment of the monastic life, offering a sense of belonging. Historians have noted that the Church of the 13th century was strangely obsessed with male sexuality while remaining largely indifferent to what happened between women. Because the prevailing medical and theological theories of the time did not recognize the possibility of female sexual agency without a male presence, many of these intimate bonds were simply not seen as a threat. A bishop might see two nuns walking hand in hand or sharing a bed and interpret it as a sign of holy friendship or virginal innocence. This blind spot in the patriarchal imagination provided a decade of freedom for the sisters to explore the depths of their mutual affection. This era of relative peace allowed some convents to become true centers of female flourishing, where the bond of the sisters was the primary force holding the community together. In these places, the traditional vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience were reinterpreted through the lens of their shared life. Poverty meant sharing everything with the beloved, chastity meant a total focus on the female community, and obedience was given to the collective will of the sisters rather than a distant male god. It was a radical, if silent, restructuring of the religious life that placed human connection at the very center of the quest for the divine. The emotional landscape of these communities was not without its tensions, as jealousy and the pain of separation could be just as intense as the love itself. When a sister was transferred to another house or when a favorite was replaced, the resulting grief was often described in letters as a form of spiritual death. These documents reveal a world where the stakes were incredibly high, and where the loss of a companion was felt as a catastrophic blow to the soul. The intensity of these feelings proves that the convent was not a place of emotional coldness, but a site of vibrant, often overwhelming, human passion that refused to be suppressed. As the century turned toward its midpoint, the wealth and independence of these lesbian-leaning orders began to attract the envious eyes of the secular clergy. The fact that groups of women could live so successfully, managing their own lands and lives without the need for husbands or male overseers, was seen as a growing challenge to the natural order. The rumors of their particular friendships began to be used as a political weapon by those who wished to seize the monastic lands or impose stricter control over the lives of the sisters. The illusion of freedom was beginning to fray at the edges, as the outside world prepared to intervene. The sisters themselves seemed to sense the closing of the windows, as their letters became more guarded and their public behavior more performative in its piety. They knew that the sanctuary they had built was fragile and that the very things that gave them life, their intimacy, their education, and their independence, were the things that would eventually lead to their persecution. In the quiet hours of the night, as they lay together in the common dormitory, the sound of the wind against the stone walls seemed to carry the voices of a changing world, one that would no longer tolerate the existence of a love that didn't need a man. Thus, the 13th century convent stood as a brief, shining example of what women could create when left to their own devices in a world that didn't understand them. It was a place where the daughters of the nobility transformed their exile into a kingdom of their own making, where the rules of the heart took precedence over the laws of the church. These women were not just victims of a patriarchal system, they were architects of a secret society that flourished in the shadows of the cathedrals. Their story is one of resilience and the enduring power of the human need for touch and recognition, even in the most restricted of circumstances. The legacy of these sisters is written in the silence of the archives and the empty niches of the ruined abbeys that still dot the European landscape. While the names of their lovers have been lost to time, the structures they inhabited remain as a testament to a time when the monastery was the only place a woman could truly be herself. In the end, the history of these lesbian orders is a reminder that love always finds a way to grow, even in the cracks of the most formidable stone walls, and that the whispers of the past can still be heard if one knows how to listen to the silence. The archives of the 13th century are filled with deep shadows, where the ink of the chroniclers seems to fade just as the narrative approaches the most intimate corners of the cloister. These documents, written with a cautious hand and veiled in the heavy metaphors of the church, describe a phenomenon known as spiritual friendship. To the casual observer, these were merely bonds of holy affection, but beneath the surface of the Latin prose, there beat the heart of a far more tangible and earthly devotion. It was a world where the line between the divine and the physical was blurred by the very intensity of the life led behind the high stone walls. The concept of the spiritual friend was rooted in the teachings of the Church Fathers, who argued that two souls could find a reflection of God's love in one another. However, within the confines of the female orders, this theological loophole became a gateway for passions that the male hierarchy could not fully comprehend. In the silence of the library or the rhythmic peace of the garden, sisters found that their intellectual and spiritual alignment naturally sought a physical expression. What began as a shared study of the scriptures often transformed into a profound need for proximity, a craving for the warmth of a companion who truly understood the soul. In some orders, the sisters became masters of a complex linguistic dance, using the language of mysticism to justify the intensity of their feelings. They spoke of the merging of souls and the burning fire of love for the bridegroom, Christ, yet the descriptions they recorded often mirrored the physical ecstasy of human lovers. By framing their devotion as a religious experience, they created a protective shield around their intimacy. If a sister wept in the arms of another after a long night of prayer, it was interpreted by the outside world as an overflow of divine grace rather than a manifestation of a deep, personal, and prohibited longing. This masking of carnal attraction as religious fervor was not merely a survival tactic, it was a way for these women to sanctify their own experiences in a world that otherwise condemned them. They occupied a strange middle ground where the erotic and the holy were inextricably linked, allowing them to explore the heights of passion while remaining within the bounds of monastic law. When they wrote of being consumed by a divine flame, the imagery they used was so vivid and visceral that it left little doubt about the physical reality of their sensations. The monastery provided the perfect theater for this performance of spiritualized desire. The figure of the abbess stood at the very center of this complex emotional web, acting as a sovereign who commanded absolute obedience and loyalty. In the 13th century, an abbess was often a woman of immense political and social standing, wielding power that rivaled that of the local lords. Within her domain, she was the ultimate arbiter of truth and morality, and her word was the only law that mattered. This autonomy allowed many abbesses to establish their own internal courts, where favoritism and personal affection were the primary currencies of influence. The power of the office was used to create a private sanctuary for their chosen companions. History has preserved subtle but clear evidence of how these powerful women selected favorites among the younger novices, bestowing upon them privileges that set them apart from the rest of the community. A favorite might be granted a private cell adjacent to the abbess, or she might be chosen to accompany the superior on long journeys to other estates. These selections were rarely based on religious merit alone, they were the result of a profound emotional and physical attraction that the abbess chose to nurture. To the young novice, such attention was both a blessing and a heavy burden, as it offered protection while binding her to the will of a master. The privileges bestowed upon these favorites often extended to the material world, creating a visible hierarchy of affection within the abbey. While the rest of the sisters followed a life of strict austerity, the favorites might enjoy better food, finer wool for their habits, or access to rare books and musical instruments. These displays of favoritism were a source of constant tension and whispered scandal, yet they were rarely challenged openly. The authority of the abbess was so absolute that to question her choices was to risk excommunication or severe physical punishment. The internal life of the monastery was thus governed by the heart. Whispers of these unions eventually traveled beyond the monastery gates, reaching the ears of the bishops and the secular clergy who oversaw the religious orders. In the village marketplaces and the halls of power, people spoke of the secret loves of the sisters, mixing tales of holiness with suggestions of depravity. These rumors were a constant threat to the reputation of the church, yet the reaction of the ecclesiastical hierarchy was surprisingly pragmatic. They were men of the world who understood that the survival of the institution depended more on stability and wealth than on the private behavior of a group of women who remained out of sight. The bishops often preferred to turn a blind eye to what was happening behind the cloister walls, as long as the outward appearance of piety was maintained. Their primary concern was not the moral purity of the sisters' beds, but the security of the monastery's property and the steady flow of tithes and donations. If a scandal became too loud, it could lead to a loss of land or a decline in the prestige of the order, which was a far greater disaster than the existence of a few particular friendships. As long as the bells rang for the canonical hours and the prayers were said, the church was willing to ignore the rhythmic whispers of the night. This policy of strategic silence created a unique window of opportunity for the lesbian orders to flourish throughout the middle of the 13th century. It was a time of relative equilibrium, where the needs of the individual women were balanced against the institutional requirements of the church. The sisters learned to navigate this delicate landscape with great skill, ensuring that their private lives remained hidden while their public duties were performed with flawless precision. They were the architects of their own freedom, using the very structures intended to confine them as a means to build a life of their own choosing. However, the peace was always contingent upon the discretion of the sisters and the continued indifference of the men in power. The bishop's tolerance was not born of compassion or understanding, but of a cold, political calculation that could change at any moment. The sisters knew that they were living on borrowed time, and that the whispers of the world could easily turn into a roar of condemnation. In the quiet moments between their duties, they must have felt the fragility of their world, knowing that their love was a secret that could destroy the very sanctuary they had worked so hard to maintain and protect against the outside. As the years passed, the documentation of these spiritual friendships became even more encrypted, as if the sisters themselves sensed the coming storm. They began to use even more obscure metaphors, burying their true feelings under layers of allegorical complexity that only an initiate could decipher. The letters they exchanged were masterpieces of double meaning, where a simple prayer for a sister's health could be read as a passionate longing for her touch. This intellectual shielding was their final defense against a world that was slowly beginning to lose its patience with the autonomy of women and the secrets of the cloisters. The economic power of the convents remained their strongest shield, for as long as they were wealthy, they were untouchable. The daughters of the nobility brought with them vast fortunes that the church was loath to jeopardize by initiating aggressive investigations into the private lives of the donors. This created a paradoxical situation where the very wealth that symbolized their submission to the church was the same tool that guaranteed their privacy. The Abbesses understood this dynamic perfectly, using their financial influence to keep the bishops at bay and to ensure that the silence of the corridors remained undisturbed by the heavy boots of inquisitors. In the end, the 13th century convent was a place of immense complexity, where the highest aspirations of the soul lived side by side with the most basic needs of the body. It was a world of whispers and shadows, of burning candles and cold stone, where women found a way to love that the rest of society could not name. The history of these spiritual friendships is a testament to the ingenuity of the human heart, which refuses to be silenced even by the most powerful institutions of its time. Under the watchful eyes of the bishops, the sisters continued to weave their lives together, creating a tapestry of devotion that was both holy and human. The logic of the era dictated that as long as the status quo was preserved, the truth could remain buried in the silence of the archives. But silence is a heavy burden to carry, and the weight of these secrets began to press harder against the walls of the monasteries. The tension between the private reality of the sisters and the public expectations of the Church was reaching a breaking point. As the 13th century moved toward its final decades, the whispers that had been ignored for so long started to carry a new, more dangerous tone, signaling that the era of blind eyes and strategic silence was coming to a dark and unpredictable end. For a long time, the highest echelons of the ecclesiastical hierarchy existed in a state of profound and almost comical bewilderment when faced with the reality of female desire. The great minds of the 13th century, who spent their lives categorizing every possible sin in exhaustive detail, found themselves standing at the edge of a conceptual abyss whenever they considered the lives of women in the cloisters. Their world was one of rigid, masculine definitions where the very idea of passion was tied to the presence of a man. Without the male element, they were effectively blind to the complex emotional and physical landscapes that were quietly flourishing behind the thick, silent walls of the many abbeys across the continent. This institutional blindness was rooted in the prevailing biological theories of the era, heavily influenced by the recovered works of Aristotle and the early scholastics. Theologians of the 13th century sincerely believed that women lacked an active principle, viewing them as passive vessels whose only role was to receive. In their eyes, a woman was an incomplete version of a man, devoid of the heat and agency required to initiate a truly significant act of nature. Therefore, any intimacy that might occur between two sisters was often dismissed not as a grave moral transgression, but as a minor, almost childish deviation that did not merit the full weight of the Church's wrath. The legal frameworks of the time, specifically the evolving canon law, were almost entirely focused on the concept of male adultery and the illicit spilling of seed. Because the medieval mind associated the severity of a sexual crime with its potential to disrupt the natural order of procreation, female intimacy occupied a strange, unregulated vacuum. If no male seed was involved, many legal scholars argued that no true sexual act had taken place in the eyes of the law. This bizarre loophole meant that while men faced the threat of the stake or exile for their transgressions, women were often left to their own devices, protected by the very patriarchal prejudices that sought to diminish them. Within the quiet rooms of the Vatican and the university halls of Paris, these relationships were often labeled as mere feminine folly or silly games. High-ranking bishops would hear reports of sisters sharing beds or spending hours in private, whispered conversation, yet they would often chuckle and dismiss it as a temporary madness caused by the isolation of the monastic life. They viewed the sisters as overgrown children who simply needed a more disciplined routine or a stricter confessor to set them right. This patronizing attitude served as an unintended shield, granting the inhabitants of the monasteries a level of privacy that would have been unthinkable for any other group in society. This period of institutional ignorance bestowed upon the sisters decades of relative peace, allowing them to cultivate a world that was entirely their own. As long as the outward appearance of the monastery remained impeccable, the internal reality was rarely scrutinized with any real fervor. The sisters learned that the key to their survival lay in the flawless performance of their religious duties. By attending every service, maintaining the gardens, and managing the abbey's finances with expert care, they bought the right to their nighttime secrets. The Church was satisfied with the ritual, leaving the heart of the community to beat in a rhythm of its own making. This created what could be described as an invisible archipelago of female tenderness and passion, stretching from the rugged coasts of Britain to the sun-drenched valleys of Italy. These convents were not just places of worship, but interconnected nodes of a hidden society where women were the sole masters of their environment. Within this archipelago, the traditional rules of the world were suspended. A young girl from a noble family, once destined for a cold marriage, might find herself in the arms of a kindred soul, discovering a depth of connection that no theology book had ever prepared her for. It was a secret geography of the heart, mapped in the darkness of the cells. The daily life of the sisters was a carefully choreographed dance between the public and the private. During the daylight hours, they were the very image of virginal purity, their faces hidden by veils and their voices raised in sacred song. They moved through the cloisters with a practiced humility that reassured any visiting inspector of their total devotion to the bridegroom. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the final echoes of the evening bells faded into the dusk, the masks would begin to slip. The monastery would transform into a space where the touch of a hand or a lingering gaze was the only prayer that truly mattered to those who remained awake. In these hours, the common dormitory or the private cell became a sanctuary where the silly games of the bishops were revealed as profound, life-altering bonds. These women were not playing, they were building entire emotional universes that provided the only warmth in a cold, stone world. The intimacy they shared was a radical act of reclamation, taking a life that had been chosen for them and filling it with a love of their own choosing. The crucifix on the wall might have been the official focus of their devotion, but the warmth of the body next to them was the reality that sustained them through the long, lonely years of their monastic exile. The sisters were acutely aware of the delicate balance they maintained, and they developed a sophisticated culture of internal protection. They knew that one slip of the tongue or one overly dramatic public display could shatter the peace of the entire community. Consequently, they enforced a code of discretion that was more rigorous than any rule imposed from the outside. They looked out for one another, creating a web of mutual support that ensured that temporary madness remained invisible to the male visitors. This internal solidarity was the true foundation of their archipelago, a collective agreement to guard the sanctuary they had so carefully constructed. Even the confessors, who were often the only men allowed regular contact with the sisters, were frequently complicit in this silence, whether through genuine naivety or a desire to avoid trouble. A priest might hear a sister confess to a too strong affection for a companion and prescribe a few extra prayers, never suspecting the true depth of the relationship. To him, it was a minor feminine weakness, a lack of focus that was to be expected from the weaker sex. The sisters learned to use the language of the confessional to minimize their actions, feeding the priests the stories they expected to hear while keeping the truth for themselves. This era of the 13th century was a unique window in history, a time when the patriarchal structures of the Church were strong enough to be arrogant but not yet paranoid enough to be truly observant. The intellectual arrogance of the theologians, who believed they understood the limits of female capability, was the very thing that blinded them. They could not imagine a world where women were not just passive observers but active participants in their own romantic destinies. Because it was unimaginable to them, it was effectively non-existent in their records, allowing the archipelago of passion to expand and deepen without any interference. The wealth of the noble daughters who entered the convents also played a role in maintaining this status quo. The Church was loath to investigate too closely the private lives of women whose families provided the gold and land that kept the ecclesiastical machinery running. There was a silent understanding that as long as the estates were well managed and the tithes were paid, the internal affairs of the abbey were the business of the abbess and her charges. Money bought a great deal of silence in the 13th century, and the lesbian orders were among the primary beneficiaries of this transactional morality that defined the late medieval period. For the women inside, this was not a life of sin, but a life of survival and fulfillment in the only way available to them. They were not seeking to overthrow the Church or challenge its dogmas, they simply wanted a space where they could be human. The nightly secrets were the small, bright flames that kept their spirits from being extinguished by the crushing weight of their vows. In each other's company, they found a reflection of their own humanity that the world outside refused to acknowledge. The monastery, intended to be a place of isolation, had become the ultimate site of connection. This invisible archipelago was not just a collection of isolated incidents but a widespread cultural phenomenon that left its mark on the emotional history of the era. While it left few formal records, its presence can be felt in the art, the music, and the clandestine letters that have survived the centuries. It was a world of whispers, of shared laughter in the laundry rooms, and of quiet tears shed in the shadows of the chapel. It was a testament to the endurance of the human heart, which will always find a way to navigate around the obstacles placed in its path by those who seek to control it. As the 13th century progressed, the sisters became more confident in their hidden lives, perhaps even forgetting how fragile their peace truly was. The institutional ignorance of the Church was a shield, but it was a shield made of glass. They had lived for so long in the shadows that they began to believe the darkness would last forever. They continued to perform their rituals, to sing their matins and lauds, and to keep their cells locked against the world, unaware that the theological winds were beginning to shift and that the silly games they played were about to be reclassified in the most terrifying of ways. For now, however, the archipelago remained hidden and vibrant. The bishops stayed in their palaces, the theologians stayed in their books, and the sisters stayed in each other's arms. It was a time of equilibrium, a historical accident that allowed a forbidden love to become the norm within the very institutions designed to suppress it. The stones of the monasteries absorbed the heat of their bodies and the sound of their whispers, keeping their secrets safe for another generation. The era of the invisible archipelago was a rare moment of grace in a harsh century, a secret history of passion that lived and breathed behind the heavy, silent doors. The final decades of the 13th century brought a cold, sharp wind that rattled the stained glass windows of the great abbeys, signaling the end of an era of whispered tolerance. The sun was setting on the age of institutional indifference, replaced by a growing shadow that stretched from the halls of the newly established Inquisition. Across the continent, the atmosphere within the monastic walls shifted from a quiet sanctuary to a landscape of pervasive suspicion. The holy simplicity that had once allowed the sisters to live and love in the margins of the law was being systematically dismantled by a church that had suddenly found its eyes and its voice. The rise of the mendicant orders and the refinement of inquisitorial techniques meant that the Church was no longer satisfied with the mere outward appearance of piety. A new breed of investigators, trained in the rigors of scholastic logic and obsessed with the detection of hidden deviance, began to cast their gaze toward the cloisters. They did not see the sisters as innocent, passive vessels anymore, but as potential harborers of a secret, spiritual rot. This change was not a sudden explosion but a creeping frost that turned the familiar warmth of the common dormitory into a place of icy dread where every breath was measured. The loss of what theologians called holy simplicity was perhaps the most devastating blow to the internal life of the convents. Previously, a deep affection between two women was seen as a lack of discipline or a minor folly, but now, it was being reclassified as something far more sinister. The casual acceptance of spiritual friendships vanished, replaced by an obsessive need to categorize every gesture. A hand held too long or a secret shared in the garden was no longer a sign of sisterly devotion, it was a symptom of a deeper, unnatural rebellion against the divine order that the Inquisition was sworn to protect and restore. The inspections of the monasteries grew increasingly frequent and invasive, as the inspectors were no longer content to sit in the Abbesses' parlor and drink wine. They began to walk the corridors, to peer into the cells, and to demand access to the private correspondence of the sisters. The questions they asked were no longer about the frequency of prayer or the quality of the singing, they were sharp, clinical, and often obscene. They sought to uncover the physical mechanics of intimacy, forcing women to speak of things that had previously existed only in the wordless language of the heart, stripping away the dignity of their silence. In this new climate of fear, the patriarchal mind underwent a terrifying evolution in its understanding of female agency. If a woman was capable of independent passion, the theologians reasoned, it could not be of her own making, for she was still seen as the weaker vessel. Therefore, any intense bond between two sisters was reimagined as the work of external, malevolent forces. The love that had given these women the strength to survive their isolation was now rebranded as a form of demonic possession. The devil, it was said, was using the weakness of women to infiltrate the very heart of the Church's most sacred and protected gardens. The accusation of demonic influence was a powerful weapon, for it allowed the Inquisition to bypass the usual legal protections and dive straight into the psyche of the accused. If a sister confessed to loving another, it was taken as proof that she had invited a demon into her soul to kindle such unnatural fires. This psychological terror turned the sisters against themselves, making them fear their own feelings as if they were a contagion. The sanctuary of the cell became a site of frantic self-examination, where every memory of tenderness was scrutinized for the touch of the sulphurous, transforming their past joy into a source of absolute horror. History records chilling instances where entire communities were subjected to these relentless investigations, turning the abbey into a theater of collective trauma. In some cases, a single whisper of a particular friendship was enough to trigger a full-scale inquiry that lasted months. The inquisitors would isolate the sisters, forbidding them from speaking to one another, and use the techniques of psychological exhaustion to extract confessions. They looked for patterns of excessive familiarity, a term that became a catch-all for any relationship that threatened the absolute vertical authority of the male-dominated hierarchy over the female soul. The love that had once been a lifeline, a way to endure the cold stone and the endless repetition of the hours, was transformed in an instant into a death sentence. To be found guilty of such unnatural affection was no longer a matter for a few extra fasts or a temporary penance. It was a crime that struck at the very root of the monastic vow, an act of treason against the bridegroom. The penalty could be the stake, but more often it was the murus, the living death of perpetual solitary confinement in a lightless cell, where the only companion was the crushing weight of one's own supposed and collective damnation. As the inquisitors sharpened their quills, the sisters scrambled to erase the evidence of their former lives. The scriptoriums, once places of creative and intellectual flourish, became sites of frantic destruction. Letters that had been cherished for years were cast into the hearth, their parchment curling and blackened as the words of devotion turned to ash. Mementos of shared lives, a dried flower, a scrap of silk, a small carving, were buried in the earth or thrown into the abbey's well. The physical world of their intimacy was being liquidated, leaving behind a void that the Church intended to fill with nothing but penitence. The most painful aspect of this period was the betrayal it forced upon the community. To save themselves, or under the pressure of the rack and the threat of excommunication, sisters began to testify against those they had once held most dear. The intimacy that had been their strength was now used as a lever to break them. One woman's description of a shared night was used to condemn another, turning the memory of a caress into a weapon of the state. This erosion of trust was a secondary, invisible death that killed the spirit of the sisterhood long before the physical punishments were ever actually carried out. The authority of the abbess, once so absolute and protective, was systematically undermined by the male visitors. She was often the first to be targeted, accused of either gross negligence or active participation in the unnatural life of her house. By stripping the mother of the house of her power, the inquisitors left the younger sisters vulnerable and leaderless. The private quarters of the abbess, which had served as a sanctuary for the elite and their favorites, were broken open and searched, revealing the small luxuries and comforts that were now presented as evidence of a sinful and decadent lifestyle. The theological shift was complete, the silly games were now mortal sins, and the temporary madness was diabolical conspiracy. This was not just a change in law, but a change in the very perception of reality. The Church was no longer willing to tolerate any space that it did not fully control and understand. The archipelago of passion was being systematically invaded, island by island, its inhabitants forced to choose between the public denial of their hearts or the private agony of the dungeon. The light of the 13th century was fading, leaving only the flickering torches of the inquisitors in the gloom. The fear of one's own heart became a pervasive sickness within the cloisters. Sisters began to practice a form of extreme self-censorship, not just in their speech, but in their very thoughts. They learned to kill any flicker of affection before it could be seen in their eyes, transforming themselves into the hollow, lifeless statues that the Church demanded they be. The vibrant, intellectual, and emotional life that had characterized the middle of the century was replaced by a sterile, terrified silence. The love that had been a rebellion was now a ghost, haunting the corridors where it had once walked openly and with a measure of pride. The physical space of the monastery changed to reflect this new reality. New regulations demanded the installation of more bars on the windows, more locks on the doors, and the removal of any partitions that might offer even a moment of privacy. The common areas were redesigned to ensure that no two women were ever truly alone. The architecture of the monastery was being refined into a machine for surveillance, a panopticon of stone where every movement was observed and every whisper was recorded. The sanctuary had finally become a prison in the most literal and modern sense of the word. As the century drew to its dark conclusion, the legacy of the lesbian orders was being written in the blood and tears of those who had dared to love outside the lines. The stories of their intimacy were now found only in the records of their trials, distorted by the language of the inquisitors and the shame of the accused. The era of the hidden archipelago was over, destroyed by a world that could not allow women to have anything of their own, least of all their hearts. The sisters who remained were left to navigate a world of shadows, where the only thing more dangerous than the Inquisition was the memory of what they had lost. In the final accounting, the tragedy of the late 13th century was not just the physical suffering of the sisters, but the total erasure of their truth. The love that had been a vibrant reality was now a monstrous fiction, or a demonic delusion. The sisters were forced to live out their remaining days in a world that told them their most profound experiences were nothing but filth and lies. As the torches of the inspectors moved on to the next abbey, they left behind a silence that was no longer the silence of prayer, but the silence of a grave, where the secrets of the heart were buried forever. The cruelty of the 13th century did not find its peak in the heat of the stake or the cold iron of the dungeon, but in a much more subtle and enduring form of violence that targeted the very essence of human existence. When the Inquisitors concluded their grim work within the abbey walls, they were not content with merely breaking the bodies of the women who had dared to seek intimacy with one another. They understood that to truly kill a sentiment, one must kill the memory of its existence forever. Thus, the final act of the tragedy was not a trial, but a systematic and cold-blooded campaign of total erasure that sought to scrub the record of all these hidden lives. In the very scriptoriums where the sisters had once shared stolen glances over golden ink, a new and darker kind of labor began under the watchful eyes of the Church. Men with sharp knives and hard hearts sat before the ancient ledgers, methodically scraping away the names of the accused from the parchment until the surface was raw. The sound of steel against dried skin was the only rhythm in the room as decades of intimate history were turned into a fine, white dust that settled on the floor. Each name removed was a life deleted and a legacy discarded, as the Church sought to retroactively unmake the dead and ensure no future eyes would ever read of their devotion. The archives, which should have been a repository of truth, were transformed into a graveyard of redacted thoughts and censored emotions by those who feared the power of female connection. Correspondence that had once carried the warmth of a lover's breath, letters detailing shared dreams, small kindnesses, and the profound depth of spiritual and physical union, were gathered into piles in the courtyard. As the flames took hold of the delicate paper, the words of thousands of women vanished into the autumn sky in the form of soot and smoke. This was a deliberate destruction of the female voice, a calculated fire meant to leave behind nothing but the sterile narrative of the elite. For those found guilty of the most unnatural affections, the punishment was designed to mimic the eternal silence the Church wished to impose on the history of the cloisters. They were led to the dreaded muris, the wall, where they were bricked into solitary cells that would become their permanent tombs for the remainder of their natural lives. Denied the sight of the sun and the sound of a human voice, they were left with nothing but bread, water, and the crushing weight of their own memories. This was the ultimate isolation, a physical manifestation of the erasure the Church was performing on the scrolls, turning a vibrant human being into a living shadow whose name would never be spoken. The logic of this total oblivion was rooted in the idea that if a sin could not be named or remembered, it effectively ceased to exist in the eyes of God and men alike. By destroying the evidence of these lesbian orders, the theologians of the late 13th century sought to restore a fantasy of virginal purity that had never actually existed in the way they imagined. They wanted the world to believe that the brides of Christ had never been anything more than hollow vessels for divine grace, devoid of the messy, beautiful complexities of earthly love. This historical forgery was so successful that for hundreds of years, the truth remained buried under layers of cold stone and lies. We must imagine the terror of the sisters who remained behind, forced to watch as their friends and mentors were erased from the collective memory of the house they shared. They were coerced into participating in the lie, walking the corridors as if their companions had never existed and singing hymns in choir stalls where empty spaces now yawned like open wounds. The psychological toll of this forced forgetting was perhaps the most enduring scar of the era, creating a community of ghosts who were alive in body but dead in history. They became the silent guardians of a truth they could never again share with the world outside, bound by a vow of terror and grief. The chroniclers who eventually wrote the history of these monasteries were men who had never set foot in a women's dormitory and who viewed the female experience through a lens of suspicion. They edited the past to fit the requirements of the present, smoothing over the scandals and irregularities until only the most orthodox and boring accounts remained in the official books. Through their pens, the vibrant archipelago of passion was submerged beneath a sea of clerical indifference and patriarchal control. They were the architects of the void, deciding which stories were worthy of the light and which were to be cast into the outer darkness of eternal neglect for the sake of order. This process of rewriting was so thorough that it created a false sense of continuity in the religious life, as if the 13th century had been a monolithic period of simple piety. The diverse expressions of female autonomy and desire were flattened into a single, acceptable image of the submissive nun who sought only the divine. This was a profound theft of identity, not just from the women of that time, but from all the generations that followed, who were denied the knowledge that they had ancestors who had fought for the right to define their own hearts. The loss is immeasurable, a missing limb in the body of human social history that can never be fully restored or healed. Thousands of women who loved one another in the shadow of the Gothic vaults will never have their stories told with the precision or the tenderness they deserve in our modern age. We do not know the names they whispered to each other in the dark, or the specific poems they composed in the margins of their prayer books during the long hours of the night. Their laughter, their arguments, and their moments of profound physical and spiritual bliss are all gone, replaced by the ringing, furious void that now haunts the study of the medieval cloister. We are left only with the echoes of what must have been, a haunting suspicion that the most important parts of the past have been stolen. When we look at the ruins of these great abbeys today, we see only the skeletal remains of an architecture designed for control and the suppression of the human spirit. The cold stone of the cloisters and the empty niches of the chapels feel devoid of human warmth, but that is because the warmth was intentionally drained away by the Inquisitors. Underneath the moss and the crumbling masonry lie the broken hearts of those whose love was declared impossible by the men in power. The stones remember what the scrolls forgot, but they do not speak, they only stand as silent witnesses to a crime of memory that has lasted for over 700 years, hiding the traces of a passion. The emotional reaction to this realization is one of profound indignation and a lingering sense of fear that can be felt in the very air of these ancient sites. It is the fear that even today, the truth of our lives can be erased by those who hold the pens and the keys to the archives of the world. The story of the lesbian orders of the 13th century is a warning about the fragility of history and the power of the institution to define what is real. The anger we feel at this erasure is a tribute to the women who were silenced, a way of acknowledging their existence even when the record fails us. Their impossible love was real enough to terrify the most powerful men. There is a particular kind of anger that arises when one confronts the furious void and realizes the extent of the cultural destruction that took place in the name of God. It is the rage of knowing that something precious was taken and then hidden so well that even the loss itself was forgotten by the descendants of those women. We are forced to piece together the fragments of their lives from the very documents meant to condemn them, looking for the truth in the spaces between the Inquisitors' lies. This detective work of the soul is the only way to honor the sisters who were cast into the Muris, turning their punishment into a testament of their endurance and their love. In the end, the history of the 13th century monasteries is not a story of spiritual triumph, but a tragedy of human suppression that echoes through the corridors of time. The Church may have succeeded in scraping the names off the parchment, but it could not erase the fact that these women once lived, breathed, and found solace in one another. The void they left behind is not empty. It is filled with the resonance of their defiance and the heat of their forgotten embraces. By acknowledging the silence, we begin to break it, allowing the ghosts of the sisters to finally find a place in our collective understanding. Their love was not a sin, the sin was the attempt to hide it. As the shadows grow long over the ruined walls of the old abbeys, we must learn to listen to the silence in a new way that honors the complexity of the human heart. It is not a peaceful silence, but a ringing one, vibrating with the untold stories of thousands of hearts that refuse to be cold. The impossible nature of their love was its greatest strength, for it existed outside the boundaries of a world that tried to define everything through a male lens. That passion, though buried under 7 centuries of oblivion, still has the power to provoke a deep emotional reaction, reminding us that no matter how hard the powerful try to burn the past, the truth has a way of leaving a mark. We finish this journey not with a sense of closure, but with a lingering, restless grief for the lost archive of the heart that will never be recovered in its entirety. The furious void is our inheritance, a reminder that every stone in these ruins is a monument to a forgotten embrace and a life lived in the shadows of the cross. The 13th century was a time of great light and even greater darkness, and in the intersection of the two, these women found a way to be free, if only for a few decades. Their legacy is the very void we now contemplate, a space that demands to be filled with the recognition of their courage. They loved in the shadows, and now they begin to be seen. Ultimately, the history of these sisters is a testament to the fact that the human spirit cannot be fully contained by stone or ink, no matter how much force is applied. The attempt to destroy their memory was a failure because the void they left behind is too loud to be ignored by those who seek the truth. It calls to us from the ruins, demanding that we look closer and feel the heat that once warmed these cold corridors in the dead of winter. The names may be gone, but the passion remains, a permanent part of the human story that no inquisitor could truly extinguish. We leave the cloisters with a heavy heart, knowing that the greatest dramas were never meant to be told. The final image of this history is one of a vast, empty library where the shelves are filled with blank books that seem to pulse with a hidden life. This is the library of the women of the 13th century, a space where the ink has been scraped away but the indentation of the quill remains on the page. We run our fingers over the ghosts of their words, feeling the shape of their love in the hollows of the parchment. This is the only way to read their story now, through the tactile memory of their absence. Their lives were a rebellion, their love was a sanctuary, and their erasure is a challenge to us all to never let the silence win the final battle for the past.